If you want to support the Missing Witches Project, find out how at missingwitches.com and pre-order New Moon Magic, 13 Anti-Capitalist Tools for Resistance and Reenchantment by Risa Dickens and Amy Torrett.
You aren't being a proper woman, therefore you must be a witch. You must be a witch.
Welcome. Welcome home to the Missing Witches podcast. Welcome, Coven. Welcome, friends and strangers and tech witches and harvest witches and activist witches and whatever flavor you fucking feel like today. We're excited to see you. Are you making berry offerings? Are you just barely surviving? We love you. We want to make the biggest, joyfulest tent of this work of the resistance and the reenchantment as we have it in the name of our new book. And part of that means looking at like who feels at home in our circles and how we make spaces of home feeling. And we're really not anti-men. That's just never fucking been a part of it for us. Fuck the patriarchy forever. But men have suffered under that system for a long and brutal time. And it's just something we want to think about and talk about. And Lunasa seems like a time to think about it. You know, there you have these traditions of a warrior god or a craftsman god. And some people will talk to today might know more about that than I do. And certainly know a lot about craft and have wrestled more with masculinities than I have, although I've wrestled with my share. So we welcome our friends, our wise friends today to a conversation that we're sort of loosely making a container to call craft, masculinities, and magic. These are friends who weave beautiful things, literally and figuratively, and we're so excited to be with them today. Amy, how are you before we open up the gates to these kind, magical people? And how are you feeling about Lunasa and Lammas tide?
I love a halfway point. As you know, they're so bittersweet. The halfway point between the first day of summer and the first day of fall it's hot and sweaty, but there's a shadow on the horizon. And as a witch, I kind of love that. I kind of love these like non-binary halfway points and between equinoxes and solstices and that kind of thing. So this is a very comfortable time for me. I'm comfortably being hot. I'm comfortable being sweaty. I'm comfortable taking a moment to enjoy the fruit of a harvest before I get into what I have to do next. So again, this time for me, sometimes it's those first berries, those first wild raspberries that I find in the yard. So yeah, again, it's a balance of forward thinking and also just like languishing in the heat and swinging on a hammock. I always find myself between these two places on these between times. And I'm so excited to be hanging out with our guests today. And again, get into that, non-binary universe that we actually live in, where we can question gender essentialism and we can ask, like, what does masculinity mean to us and you and all of you who are listening? One of our first events that we did as Missing Witches, we were invited to talk about the divine feminine. And so we went into that with our presentation largely questioning, okay, well, then we need to ask, what is femininity? What does that mean? Before we can get into the divinity, first, let's try to define the femininity. So again, Remy specifically, maybe we'll start with you and your introduction. And I want to say something first that maybe you can talk to, is that when we met, you told me a very interesting story about the history and origins of knitting. And we were kind of laughing about how it's now become perceived as like a feminine domestic art, when based on what you told me, it was an act of survival. It was a hunting mechanism. Anyway, I don't want to say anymore. Hi. Our guests today are Jonathan and James and Remy, and we're so grateful to be in circle with you all today. Thank you.
And so we'll invite you, and we'll start with you, Remy. Introduce yourselves in whatever way feels right. Who are you? What are you bringing to this conversation today? Where are you? How are you feeling? Also, I want to say all of these friends, we asked them to send their bios, and so you'll see them in the show notes and stuff. And I don't know if it is like humility in the that's tied to the state of the sort of complicatedness around being human and especially male these days, but none of you listed your actual accomplishments, which I thought was sort of delightful. So feel free to continue to not list or name check as you feel called to.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Risa. There are so many things to say. Wow, I don't even know where to start. Actually, when I got the email and received the invite for taking part in this podcast, talking about masculinity, one of my first reflex was like, but why me then? I was like, what, how can I talk about masculinity? I don't even know like what it means to me. So just to put in context, I definitely identify as a queer person. My gender is an uncertain thing. It's a fluid thing. I think I'm a very, very air person. My chart is like full of air, no fire. I'm very fluid. I go with the flow a lot. And so I've actually struggled like a lot thinking about this question about masculinity, because I actually didn't know how it was like I was identifying with that. And it's when I was writing my bio that I actually realized my relationship to masculinity is like tightly tied to failure. And I'm really happy to be able to talk about failure, because I think that being raised and socialized as a male person, like failure was not an option, especially coming from a very like science oriented family. Failure was not an option. It was only, if it was a positive thing, it was only a tool to then succeed. It was never enough. Failure was never enough. And I think my whole relationship about like with masculinity is about like the enoughness or like lack of enoughness, which I guess formed the person that I am now, and like the air entity that's now like always questioning like who I am and what I am. I want to go back to your what you were talking about, Amy, about knitting. So I'm a knitter. I've knitted for I don't know, a couple of years now. And I don't actually remember exactly the story I was telling, and maybe my viewpoint has changed a little bit now. I think now I know that there's this common belief, or like this belief now, that knitting came to life through, I think, fishing, and was actually a way to make these nets, and that these people were usually men. And there's this claim that knitting was actually invented, and I'm putting some very like big air quotes, by men. And I'm now questioning everything I know about history, especially that we have this very, very like white-centered revisionist education, and that and male supremacist as well. So I'm really ambivalent, or like I don't know what to think about this this like narrative, especially that it's sometimes, or maybe too often, used by other male crafters to justify their place, or like assess superiority, or not superiority, but just saying like, you know what, we were doing that before you, or something like that, which I think is very problematic. Also, it's a very male-centered attitude to think of it as like a competition, like who was there first and who did it first. So who has the claim on it as like our invention. So I don't remember what I said about that, Amy. And if it had to do with like claiming something, I am deeply sorry that I once thought something like that.
No, I think you and I were talking more about like the arbitrariness of gendering any kind of activity, and how it's interesting that something that was used to make clothes was possibly used to make fishing nets before that, and both of these are opposite gendered, but it's the exact same action, just used for different ways. So the whole thrust of the conversation was about like these arbitrary labelings of things as masculine or feminine. So yeah, no, we were always good.
Yeah, and now I'm always thinking like, let's remember that this like history comes from like the texts that were selected that made it through the books, and that many other societies or communities have been doing these things and like never made it through the cuts because they didn't serve the people in power. So yeah, I think it's a good idea to remember this, especially when we're talking about male or like male presenting figures in crafts that are mostly dominated by women. Like trying also to like leave this space of like, we're also okay to be invited in these spaces and not have to claim property or anything like that.
James, do you want to jump in next and do your intro and respond?
Really do. That was wonderful. I'm James. I'm playing around with using my mom's maiden name, Gardner. And I live in Cheyenne, Arapahoe, and Ute lands. It's commonly referred to as Denver. I feel like a lizard today because it is hot. I'm all fire. I'm like all fire signs, it seems like. Well, I'm a Virgo sun. Whoa! I'm a Virgo sun. So I'm a little bit of earth and fire. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm just this person who's been on this pathway for a long time, this masculinity pathway. And I can't underscore enough that the idea that masculinity is bound up with feelings of failure, feelings of shame, feelings of not being enough. I was really good at being like a Chad. Like I was like really good at it. Like I was like just really good at it. Like I well, until my mom died, then then everything falls apart, right? But I had your typical sort of absent father sort of storyline, where I was earning love by playing a sport that I was good at because I played it 6 hours a day to gain recognition and love. So, a lot of the way I talk about masculinity is my response to it. And my response to, I mean, I was like thinking about it before we dropped down, but like this masculinity wound, and this constant need, at least in my life, even as a cisgendered heterosexual man, to define myself in opposition to what I think is one of the most oppressive things that I have to deal with on a daily basis, and things that I don't have any interest in. And because I've made that choice, I'm not welcome in most spaces where people that look like me, that sound like me, typically are accepted. Well, at least until like I start talking about my values, because I'm a traitor to every form of privilege that I have, and have no interest in. This is where like the Aries rising comes out. I have no interest in being down with the Chads. Yeah, it's all fire. It's all very fire. I'm in my fire era right now. We're setting up boundaries. We're burning bridges. We're doing all that stuff, mostly to my father who is absent. And getting to I think the other thing, it's interesting how all this stuff is already like coming up right away, and stuff that I had sort of like indexed in my mind. The way that men selectively use history as a way to place themselves in and then claim ownership. It's classic glass ceiling stuff, right? So I'm a sociologist by trade. I make money by being like a researcher or whatever. And in sociology, we call that, women and femme identifying people run up against that sort of glass ceiling, right? They can only advance so far because of patriarchy, because of gender bias, because of pregnancy discrimination within workplaces. And oftentimes what men will do is they'll go into female dominated spaces, and then they're able to use those sort of cultural narratives to justify getting paid more. So that's all super interesting to me as a sociologist who's like very, very interested in taking away those sort of boundaries and doing away with gender as much as we possibly can within a system that is so built on selling us identities based on that. Anyways, before I get too far along, I'm a weaver. I'm a death worker. I love that I didn't put I'm a death worker in my in my bio.
You didn't mention sociology at all in your
No,
bio.
but again, like we're so fluid, right? Like
Yeah.
the minute you unmoor
it.
yourself, from like these labels, right? You start to realize that it's so situational. Yeah, I'm a lizard today. Like I even wondered like what of use I'd be able to say, because I've basically been outside as much as I could be with having a wage labor job. As you can tell, I'm like still sweating. I came inside from like riding my bike, being outside, it's like 90 degrees, and I'm like still sweating. Jeez, I'm a lizard.
I'm really loving the fire and air spirit of these introductions, and I want to hear, Jonathan, what you're inspired by from this. I also want to point out that Jonathan and Remy are at different rooms of their house right now, which I love. And I want to include love in these stories of exploring masculinity. And I want to include craft and how we find our ways to love. But Jonathan, you don't have to tackle all of that now. I just want to hear what you're thinking and how you're feeling.
Hi, my name is Jonathan. I am also a strong fire sign, Aries, Sun, Capricorn, Moon, and Cancer rising. And thinking about that triangulation really interests me about how that informs a lot of what I do about like plunging boldly into the fray with care and being intensely stubborn about values and things that are important to me, but that also bring me to states of retreat and withdrawal. And that's maybe more where I'm at today, and for a certain time, actually, a pulling away, backing off, backing up, like holding up in my tower, as I wrote in my bio, our third floor Montreal apartment. With a view of the mountain and the like fresh air blowing through and a vague sense of the horizon to remind me of the prairies where I grew up, and that sense of being able to see laterally and from very far distances, being able to watch a storm blow up and like roll in towards you. And I think some of that, I mean, so much of my childhood perspective, as you've also all shared, comes to inform things. And so I think about, yeah, that landscape actually is really important for me, about the sense of seeing things coming from far off. And that also has to do with anticipating danger. And that is another important part of what masculinity means for me, as being a terrain of danger and threat, and something that needs to be navigated, either out of like for self-protection, in some cases for the protection of others. That's not necessarily been my experience so much. It's more about trying to win this war of attrition, or like manage being under siege for what feels like constantly. And that my sense of like masculine identity is not something that I've been troubled by, or like in deep consideration over, or something that needs to be changed. It was more about the strange expectations that brought on for other people, and that I felt very clear on who I was, but that didn't translate to how other people approached me, or what they thought of me, or what they wanted from me. And that trying to figure out how to translate the I-ness of being, the mystery that I was also trying to uncover about myself, and yet not seeing that well reflected in the eyes of others. And as a growing up queer, white cis male who found a space to shine in theater, and like musical theater and choir, and like expressive performance spaces in the late 80s and early 90s. Of course, everyone thought and knew in a way that they had access to knowing that I didn't, that I was gay, and that meant that they had this like privileged information over me that they then tried to use. And that also was a kind of war to deal with, of saying, yes, maybe that might be true, but not in the way that you think. And actually, fuck off. You have no like space to be in my space about this. And that if I had something to share with you about this, that would be my business. And so like my sexual identity, my gender identity and expression are all things that they're difficult to pick up and like look at, because I felt like they were foisted upon me, and that I got like tarred with some brush. We were talking about Alice in Wonderland, and this image of in the Disney cartoon version of the like roses being painted red, and these like very sad standard rose bushes dripping with like red paint all over the place and being very shoddily done. And maybe I felt tarted up in this way somehow, of trying to present something that would be acceptable, and recognizing that the things that were clearly not acceptable about me, I had to find my own quiet space to live them. So that meant a lot of hiding, and a lot of closet work, and a lot of shadow work, and a lot of silence. And there are things that I'm trying to think about and find ways to articulate, and like give room to, give light to, and give space for. I also knit, and and quilt, but and cook. But it's hard. Before, I used to say that I would define myself. I never wanted to define myself using nouns, and that somehow those kind of the nouning of things, of like the being a thing, was not something that I could accept. And that was especially about being gay, or about being a man, or about being anything. I said, no, I'm a verb. I do things, and it's in the doing. But now I'm really trying to find space to not only do, because there's a very performative aspect to that, of like, I can only exist if I'm in action. I can only exist if I'm producing something, if I'm, moving forward, if there's motion. And that the sense of rest that's necessary, of recuperation, of feeling, is not, doesn't feel like that kind of doing, that kind of activeness that can be defining, that kind of mad rushing around to prove that one is worthy of taking up space. And so now I'm talking about my craft process as a process of unmaking, or of disassembling, of taking apart, of rearranging, of reorganizing. And so I think I'm like a compost heap right now, and I'm in it. And that's quite luxurious and strange place to be.
I did wonder, I would love to hear more about from maybe Remy, but from all of you, and Remy as a starting point, like, what does the idea of craft, or when did that idea start to intersect with who you were, and what did it give you, if it gave you anything? Is it tied to your sense of self? Is that sense of self, something beyond masculinity? Is it a rewriting, a reweaving of masculinity? Is it tied to your magic? I don't know, so I'm just curious.
Thank you. It's a very interesting question. I think for me, it all comes back to sense of failure, which then led me to be kind of obsessed with transformation. I wrote in my bio that I consider myself a shapeshifter, and I think both figuratively and literally. Like, I've started doing gymnastics as when I was 2. So like changing my shape all the time, moving through space in an unconventional way, but also in the figurative sense, the idea of playing with codes and probably coming from a desire to fit in, trying to learn the codes and then apply them to then fit in, feeling like in my day-to-day life I was failing at being a little boy. I soon realized that I was actually able to play with that. That actually one of the things that made me fail as a socialized male was my big sense of my big sensitivity, and like this overflow of emotions, but mostly this like being sensitive to things and maybe attuned to people's energies. So it led me to this realization that one of my powers was to take these codes and play with them and apply them. And that's probably why I started doing theater at the age of 5, which then became one of my careers. But it was always about this transformation, about transforming things. And I think the craft came in a desire to materialize these transformations. Seeing the work of like shoving something through something else and make it something else. And then, for example, thinking about knitting, like this thread that's so tiny and so easy to break, by reinforcing it with all of these loops and making it something so beautiful, which is actually like, just as I'm talking about it, like I've been questioning the sense of community for a while now, and now realizing that it's actually community that we're building when we're knitting or weaving something, because all of these joints are reinforcing the whole thing, the whole fabric. So I think in order to like create this beautiful community, it requires transformation. And it was a beautiful way for me to witness it and understand it more. And also, like, it's always felt magical. Like for me, this is when I'm able to actually see my magic, because most of it is usually invisible, and the transformation of object is an like practical, visible way of doing magic. And I'm a very visual person, so being able to see my magic was very empowering, and getting this finally this sense of success, of succeeding at transforming something that was fleece and then spinning it into yarn, and then from this like very fragile thread making it a garment, and or dyeing it and using something to like put color in my life, and other people's lives too, because they get to see me being so colorful. So yeah, I think maybe I went a little sideways, but
No,
yeah.
that's exactly where I want to go somehow, right? I want to pull at these threads. Exactly. I want to think about, like, for myself too. I mean, I think about moments where a meditation in a trying to understand what was wrong in my life and where I needed to go, and to transubstantiate previous experiences and alchemize them was spent embroidery. You know, it was just like I had to go step by step. It was all freehand. Like I just had to think my way through the fact that I could survive mistakes, that I could adapt, I could take another step, it would be okay. James, I know we need to hear your story of coming to weaving now, if you're comfortable with it, and tell
Yeah,
us
and I just
about
want to
this
say
work.
the first, based on you talking about embroidery, I mean, one of the so the person that taught me how to weave, Sarah Newbert, was somebody who was very big on the neuroscience tied to weaving. It just so happens that a lot of people in Colorado that are um, interested in weaving and teaching weaving, Rebecca Metzoff as well, they're all highlighting the healing aspects of weaving to literally put your brain back together after trauma. Like there's a reason why vets, when they came back from World War II, they would put them down. I don't know specifically about whether or not they were knitting. They probably were. I specifically know about weaving. And literally that was their way of walking home. And weaving has been my long walk home for a long time. You know, I talked about how good I was as a Chad. Okay. I laugh at myself all the time because I just have such a self-deprecating sense of humor. I just can't help it. But it's, you know, I was this person that excelled in everything they did because I wanted to be accepted by my father. I wasn't given the option to really like do art. You know, it was, PhD by 28, tennis in college, you know, whatever. Then my mom died. Then I got crippling OCD. I taught a class the next day after my mom died. I was in full plow mode, as I call it. But her final wish was to learn how to weave. She was a prolific crochet artist. I mean, she was amazing. I still have all the blankets. A lot of my woven language that I use in my weaving is based on the symbols that she put into her work. So my embrace of the feminine and the divine feminine is very deep, and it goes from always being accepted in female dominated spaces, sociology, also female dominated space, and finding allies for people that looked at masculinity, class inequality, homophobia, every phobia, xenophobia, every phobia that I'm against, finding allies in those female dominated spaces. So my mom passed away. She wanted to learn how to weave. I ended up taking a rag rug class in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is like literally an epicenter of weaving. It's the convergence of the Dene weaving culture, which goes back literally since Jump Street in terms of Dene culture. Spanish settlers, like there's literally folks that are direct descendants from the Spanish conquistadors that live in villages, predominantly Spanish villages in northern New Mexico, that are the Trujillo specifically, that are master weavers. They're amazing. They do the whole cycle. And then there was a bunch of the back to landers that came there, specifically Rachel Brown. And I got really wrapped up into that. I was just like absolutely entranced by that. This idea that you could weave in a circle. You could literally take a fleece, spin it, dye it with flowers, and weave it. And that to me is the most magical. It's as close as somebody can get to feeling like a god. And I talk about this a lot in my writing, but like you feel how divine you really are as a human being when you're wrapped up in that cycle. And I'm not saying this is like an ego trip, right? Like I don't like, whatever. Like this is sort of like on that whole like Alan Moore tip, like the British writer who talks a lot about magic. He became a ceremonial magician at 40. He like announced this at his 40th birthday party. I'm going to be a magician. He literally just made up his god. Like Alan Moore's great. Like I love Alan Moore. Like he's wonderful. And like the interesting thing that comes about when you're on that pathway of healing and the fact that your whole craft is bound up with death work, that's bound up with losing your only person, your family, is that you go through this like tremendous like death and rebirth process. I feel like I'm dying and being reborn now. Like it feels like like every season now. But like when you start to get attuned to it, like you start to see it. We talked a little bit about the shape-shifting aspect, right? Like Remy was talking a little bit about that. Druids historically are shapeshifters, right? They're these sort of like outside of convention people who like are hermits. They live out on the hedge. Like nobody can contact them, right? Like unless you really gotta go find them. And I really like that aspect of being a hedge druid. Because go figure, with my fire sign, I don't get down with many of the established orders for whatever reason. It has a lot to do with like social and political beliefs and not lining up with mine. But a lot of this whole journey that comes in and what I've realized being a crafter in female dominated spaces and being allowed to be in those spaces and being invited in and just making myself like not making myself small, but just not trying to take up much air in the room, is you realize how much of masculinity is this liminal state. I mean, like if you really start like realizing that you don't fit into the buckets, like you might like do certain things, like you're okay, accepted. But the minute you start calling people on treating women as objects, the minute you start talking and not wanting to use any homophobic slur in like normal vernacular, you're immediately kicked out of the club. Like they kick you out, they burn your armchair that you used to like watch sports ball with everybody, you drank beer in. Like you're done, you're cooked, you're kicked out, and you start to see the veil of masculinity. And you specifically within my own Irish wisdom tradition, it's a reweaving and weaving. It's crazy how much they mention weaving within the Irish wisdom tradition. John O'Donohue he uses like weaving metaphors like every 5 minutes. So John O'Donohue being like basically the heretic Catholic priest who left the church because he could not be held by the church. The church could not hold John O'Donohue because his ideas were too expansive. But it's all in line with reweaving the masculine in with the divine feminine and finding that balance so that all people, regardless of what society, what bucket they want to put them in, can use the powers, can wield the powers of creation, can wield the powers of destruction, and that all of the binaries about who's supposed to wield that, this goes back to what Yvonne Burrow is talking about in you can tell I'm nerding out now. I'm like referencing past issues. Can you tell I listen to the podcast? but she talks about like how in Wicca, her book Inclusive Wicca has done a lot of work to try to break down those binaries, and it's huge. I mean, that's what craft does for me. That's what craft is. Weaving, spinning, dyeing, foraging, growing plants, doing that weaving in a circle has allowed me to access my own divinity, has allowed me to explore mysteries within my own ancestral traditions, has allowed me to decolonize my practice in ways and my own like life in ways that I never could fathom. I mean, it goes on and on, right? It's all intersectional. It's masculinity, but it's class, but it's gender, but it's sexuality, but it's colonialism, right? It's everything. But I think me specifically, I had a big masculinity wound and I needed to rectify that. And I think one of the big healing aspects has been craft, and been able to find people who would be willing to accept me when I was kind of thrown out because I didn't believe what everybody else believed.
Jonathan, does that ring true for you too? Your experience of connecting with craft, like spaces where I don't know, Jonathan and I like cook together and it's a pleasure and a joy, to watch someone who knows so much about the craft of food and ingredient, or, hearing stories about knitting, and like May's first quilt was one that Jonathan gave her. I think of you as someone with a profound love and appreciation of craft, but I don't really know how you think about that.
Well, hearing other people talk about it, I really became overwhelmed by emotion, and I have some very personal, like long away things that I want to share. That there's an interesting thread to follow on this, and that there's an extremely personal and like sensory quality that I think is what links me to the craft that I would identify as the thing that I'm doing with my hands. And actually the thing that I'm doing with my hands right now while I'm talking is like rubbing these recycled African like glass beads that I've threaded on this strand that is really just for me to like finger and feel and like have sensory feedback from. And it actually helps me stay kind of like still and concentrated. And the act of doing this while listening, of course, reminds me of the story that my mother tells about me as an infant, which is that, well, actually the circumstance. My parents didn't want me to have a security blanket. They were very concerned that they were going to have to go through this terrible parting of me, their infant child, with this disgusting, messy, stinky thing that could never be washed and could never be left behind. And so to preemptively avoid that possibility and that grief, they swapped my blankets out every day. So I never had one blanket. I had a like plethora of them, an abundance. And it's wounding in a way to think about that I also didn't have one caretaker, but I had many, that I went into care at 6 months, and that I had many people who were like worshipped and loved me and like took care of me, but there was no sense of like a single source or like a reliable place. My therapist is aghast and was from the very beginning, many years ago when I told her this story, and she went, but the security blanket, it's a transitional object. Like it's important to bond to this thing and then to give it up because it's like so developmentally like essential to developing a sense of self, about being able to like be able to self-soothe and then leave the sense of comfort, about being able to like let it die, to put it away. And so my infant like cognitive response to this situation was to pick the fluff off of the blankets, to pick those like acrylic like nubs that would sit in the surface of all of these like early 80s synthetic woven or knitted things, and collect them into a tiny little ball. And then I also was in the story shamed for not having developed sufficient manual dexterity early and being in a low percentile about my ability to like do things with my fingertips. And so I would take my fists my kind of clumped, non-definitive fists to like hold this clump of acrylic fluff and rub it up against the side of my face for comfort. And that was my way to self-soothe, and that was my response to this like storm of sensation, of textiles, of variation, of smells, of all of that. And I have no memory of that. It's just a story that was told. And now that I retell that story in this way, it's interesting. I try to think about these things in an axiomatic way, which is to say, what if this meant this thing, and then I reacted that way? What information could I draw from that? And so I think about that nervousness, that like drive or like anxiety in my fingertips about trying to do things, about trying to hold on to something that then feels fleeting. And that also has a lot to do then to a sense of like identity. Who am I? Like, who am I to myself? Who am I to these other people? How can I be seen as worthy of care and like being picked back up again, or being like being received? And so that maybe state of anxiety, if we think about it as a what if kind of way, let's imagine this infant. Power and mastery become really important things. How can I be sure that I can rely on the world? How can I be sure that I will be in a secure or safe state? And so becoming fiercely independent is one. I won't rely on anybody. And I'm really attached also, and was as a child, to the fable of the little red hen who asked everyone to help with the planting of the seeds and the watering of, and the harvesting of the grain, and the grinding of all of these things. And the refrain all the time is like, oh, well, if you won't help, then I'll do it myself. And that kind of mantra came through of like, I'm the only person I can really rely on to take care of myself in this way, which is not to malign the abundance of care that I received and the support that I had, but this like deep internalized sense of I'm alone and I need to figure out how to make this work. And so craft became a way to develop and exert mastery. And one of the primary ways that came up as an adolescent was being able to come home as a teenager, or even as a preteen, and make lunch, and being able to have access to the space. Actually, there was a kind of ongoing fight from being extremely young to why can't I just go home? I can take care of myself. This story when I was 3 about trying to make pancakes for everyone for breakfast, and getting up early and knowing how to do all of the things and having followed all the steps in one of my first meals, and then not having woken my parents up, wanting to surprise them, but realizing that I could get all of the things, the pancake batter and the milk and the eggs and all that stuff, but I couldn't reach the bowls. So I made it on the counter. And that's not a particularly good strategy, but it's a nice place to start, and being like, oh no, I know how to do this. I knew how to walk home. I knew how to get to my address. I asked my father to let me out of the car to walk home when I was coming home from preschool. And I showed up on the front door and I knocked on the door. My mother answered and she was aghast. She's like, where's your father? It's like, oh, I walked home. I'm fine. It's no big deal. And she said, well, what? She saw my father after. Was like, what were you doing? Why did you let him walk home? And she said, I was driving in the car right next to him the whole time. It was fine. But I was so convinced that I could do these things. So food maybe is not diagnosed or not sufficiently important, higher level deal of dealing with a kind of hypoglycemia, or just consistent grumpy hangriness about needing to eat. That finding a source of nourishment and having a constant source of nourishment is really important for me. And so as a teenager, my mother started to do a master's program during night classes when she worked during the day. And so it became then my responsibility as the oldest to start to learn to cook and take care of the family. My father makes great breakfasts and is good with eggs, but that was about it. And so for my younger sister and I started making food, which was making lunches and making meals. And that meant that I could go home by myself at lunch. I could invite people over. I could carve out my own space where I could live this kind of independent feeling as a 10-year-old. Come home and eat craft dinner, or come home and do these things. And so crafting this nourishment from raw ingredients or out of a box, and a few simple things from the fridge, some Mr. Noodles package, some chicken wings boiled and then broiled with Louisiana hot sauce, some Classico spaghetti sauce with ground beef fried up. It's like these were many of my first meals. But, when you started at 12 and never stopped, like suddenly the deep dive into mastery and that power of being able to offer sustenance, but also nourishment and care, the sublimated form of care, and saying, I can provide myself with this elemental comfort every day, the beauty of eating, being able to eat, of having access to these foods, and being able to assuage this distress that's inside of me and that's inside of other people too, and to be able to do that with ease and reliability, I think is where my sense of power around that really comes from. And I have a lot more to say about knitting and other things after that, but that was a long pitch, so I'm happy to cede some space for someone else.
I totally joke by calling myself club hands. Like today, it's like part of me making fun of myself, and because my wife is a clothing maker, right? Like she's literally like designs her clothes, can sew everything. And so I was coming into fiber art as this person who's just was in the realm of ideas, getting off of a PhD, could make very interested in using my hands, but didn't have a lot of the training to do it. And I would joke in the beginning, we both went to the first weaving class together. Sarah loved Lily's weaving, absolutely adored it. And Lily just anytime she does anything fiber art related, it literally just shows out. She'll just show up and it's just amazing. And so I would joke about calling myself club hands. But you sort of see it's interesting what men do in those sorts of contexts, to touch on the idea of mastery, right? Me constantly downplaying my own ability, but also it being weird, thinking back on that first experience, yeah, my first weaving's ugly. I still have it on my Instagram grid. If you go back all 700 posts or whatever, it's still there. I'm not going to delete it. But it's interesting. This idea of self-sufficiency is also tied into my story as well, in terms of literally my dad didn't show up to hospice when my mom was sick. He didn't ask about her after she passed. At a dinner a day later, we were just it was just my sister and I. You just had to figure it out. And luckily I found weaving and everything else associated with it to sort of dig me out of that, and to have that avenue. It's just interesting when you find it, it just, in terms of your life course, finding it at such a young age. I think for me initially, body movement was a big thing, with tennis. Even though there was this whole component of seeking attention, there was still this place where I could control things in a deeply uncontrollable context of being between two divorced parents who were, battling one another. And I was asked to be the quote unquote man of the house, to defend people, right? All that garbage. And that was, I've always found these little spaces where I could be the master of my own domain. And guess what? I'm a very independent person as well because of those experiences, because I couldn't depend on other people. And I could only depend on myself to bring myself out of it. And, for Latin, the classic male sort of not going to therapy for years sort of consequences, right? I have OCD for years, don't realize it. Nobody can help me with that. I tried to meditate my way out as most as a lot of white folks have done. They look to Buddhism. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, right? If you're doing it right. I just was a particularly bad Buddhist and had all the wrong reasons for being a Buddhist. I was just trying to bypass stuff. But yeah, I really like the idea of reclaiming mastery in a way that is healing. And that part of your story really resonated with me. And I think the re-articulation of masculinity for people who are much more in line with the liminal state of masculinity is extremely healing and extremely important to give back to other men who also want the sort of exit path, exit strategy outside of the sort of the iron cage of masculinity. I'm drawing on Weber. I know it's iron cage of rationality. I'm being dramatic. I'm being a sociologist, but I'm just going to do it. The iron cage of masculinity is the same as rationality.
I want to invite you all to go with that idea. I want to talk forever, but also I really want to be respectful of bedtimes and the times that we've carved out for this. Imagine the audience for this podcast. Okay, so it's mostly women, but all of those women are thinking perhaps right now about the man in their life that they will send this episode to. Don't you think? I feel like this might be one where you're like, maybe you could listen to this and hear something that feels familiar or like welcoming or like that feels like a kinship, right? Like that's what I want. I want those men to know that there is an exit strategy from the cage, from the brutal cage, and that it involves us, a circle of love, these stitches of care, and finding a pathway out that still values your mastery and your skill, and your craft and your protection, but also doesn't rely on you being all those things all the time, that has space for all your diversity and your non-binary glory. So that's my invitation. Closing remarks.
I find it really interesting to hear how, like, it seems like the three of us came to like a mastery in a sense of relying on oneself, and this idea of I can do it all by myself, and I'm going to figure out how to do this from A to Z. For example, I started knitting, and then at some point I was like, oh, I actually would like to dye my own yarn. I want to choose my own colors. And then, oh, I'm actually really interested in spinning. I would really like to start from maybe like calm fiber or carded fiber. The only thing that stopped me from starting from a full fleece was that we don't have the space here, and it needs to be cleaned, and it needs a place to dry. And it's a big curse that we're not willing to welcome in this apartment.
You mean you don't just have like a whole like closet full of fleeces that are waiting to be cleaned? No, I think that's I do now. I'm just joking. It's just funny that because I totally commiserate with that experience.
Turn the camera around so you can see the pile of boxes that are full of fleeces waiting to be spun.
I mean, it's like fleece and yarn and fabric. But the thing that it made me realize is, and I'm also making this parallel with something else that's more intimate in my life, and I was like hesitant to decide whether I would talk about it or not, thinking that this podcast will be listened to quite widely and shared. But I think it makes sense, and it's a good parallel to do. I do rope bondage as a personal intimate practice, also publicly with other like-minded people, even teaching abroad. And I identify mostly as a bottom-leaning practitioner, which means that I receive the ropes. And it's very interesting to hear most people who get tied up in one of their motivations or one of their like their motor for doing that is the idea of letting go of control. Could be like, I know many people who have a lot of responsibilities in their day-to-day life, and they need to learn to let go of control, or they need to have this space that feels secure to put their safety into someone else's hands. And I never really identify with that. I'm never able to resonate with this statement. And for me, it's always been a feeling of being in control. And I'm actually a lot more comfortable being tied up, because I feel a lot more powerful when I'm on the receiving end, because I know that all the decisions are made, not all, but a lot of the decisions are made based on my input or based on my reactions and my safety. And in the last year or so, it made me question a lot, like these reflexes of needing to be in places where I'm always in control. And why am I not able to, or why am I not willing to give up control and to like fully trust? And I think it's this huge trap of toxic masculinity that men can only rely on themselves, and that we have to be the ones fixing things, and we have to be the ones finding solutions, or making sure that we get to our destination. And all of this, it's just smoke and mirrors. And I know that. And I've known that for a while, but yet, even in the practices that I engage in order to undo these things, I still get stuck in these traps. And I think it's one of the biggest traps of masculinity, or toxic masculinity, is to not trust that one can lose control and that it's okay.
And that resonates with my experience completely. My articulation of toxic masculinity is saying I can fix myself. I can control my own mind because it's my mind. What did it lead? I just tied my brain up in knots until I couldn't see my way out of the labyrinth, and I'd created in my own mind. Exactly. 100%. That's all toxic masculinity, right? And craft provides that, to me, this sort of decentralized space where a lot of that stuff drops away. When you're just doing a repetitive task over and over and over again, that's why I like bicycling. That's why I like weaving. It's why I like spinning. It's this space that you tap into when time slows. You know, it's very similar to, right. I mean, it's just, we all know that feeling, right? Whether it's you get it at your altar, I get it at my altar, but I get it in other places too. And the ability to unweave it. I mean, basically, when I decided to go to therapy, I was sitting at my loom, being a typical guy. I'll stop using the pejorative term, okay? I'll stop doing it. It's rude, even though I'm making fun of a formal version of myself. And we were listening to like a Krista Tippett On Being podcast, open quote, close quote, the power of podcasts, missing witches. Okay. And it was about like just, you know, sort of like the neuroscience and like what we had found. I forget who the person was, but it was just basically like approaches to anxiety, like mental health approaches to anxiety. And all of a sudden, I'm just sitting here, and I'm like, I'm going to therapy tomorrow. What? Like what? And I can't tell you the number of times that's happened with fiber art. It's weird. It's a completely, it's magic. It's just complete and utter magic. And all of a sudden I'm in therapy, and then I'm doing exposure therapy and going to the 47th realm of hell through exposure therapy, facing everything I'm ever afraid of, right? Whatever. I'm really good at suffering because of the tennis shit. Yeah. So like I did the advanced exposure therapy course. Yikes. Don't ever want to go back there. But I'm like totally comfortable with the underworld now, okay? Totally comfortable. I want to go on so many asides, but I'm going to stop. All that resonates. This is wonderful. I can see why we're all talking. This is great. We're all interwoven in such a wonderful way, and it's really beautiful.
Yeah, I'm so excited just to let you meet and get to hear you talk. I hope that we can meet again and keep talking, because there are so many more ideas. James, I'm going to come back to you because I want you to think about what your what the message is you're going to slip through the gates to the men trapped in versions of masculinity that they want to find their way out of. And Jonathan, I want to come back to you first. Yeah, there's so many things you could respond to. Just pick up any threads that feel right.
I want to pick up a thread about this immediate and burning decision to go to therapy. And for me, it was about rage. And it was about trying to figure out what to do with this anger, this like constant volcano, like magma inside of me, and trying to figure out like why I was in such like angry distress, like walking down the street and having someone walk too close to me and just feeling like ready to like totally wig out and like scream. And that the sense of being constantly invaded or slighted by other people, by sounds, by smells, by neighbors, by the city, by the like press of humanity, and being unable to kind of face that. It became interesting for me to think about and feel how much the sense of rage was actually a secondary emotion, as something that was like manifesting on the surface, and that the like primary emotion underneath that was sadness, and that I was really, really sad about a lot of things, and that I had like oceans of grief that felt uncrossable, and that has to do with giving up a lot of things, giving up on a lot of things. I trained as a theater artist, and I stopped. And I then trained hard as an opera singer, and then stopped. Part of my return to handcraft had to do with trying to anchor myself in reality, in something concrete that I could hold on to after working so much in the ephemeral. Even cooking is like a very transitory thing. Like, yes, one can be nourished and maybe, gain or lose weight related to it, but it doesn't have this like tangible ongoing feel. And the sense of the pleasure of being in rehearsal, of creating, or the supposed pleasure of being in the studio, like singing and practicing, which for me was always terrifying, of working things out, but then the next day, like having nothing to show for it. The real practice of it being like, you just need to show up every day and keep going. And that if you don't do it that day, well, then it didn't happen, like going to the gym or like any other thing. Whereas with knitting, when I picked it back up, something that I had learned as a child in admiration from watching my mother be able to do these things and saying, I want to learn how to do that too. But I picked knitting back up while I was in school as a classically trained vocalist and opera singer, because I needed something quiet. I needed something I could do with my hands while I was sitting in an orchestral rehearsal, waiting 40 minutes to stand up and sing my 2 lines and then sit back down again. I needed something that would allow me to pay attention, but that where I wouldn't feel like I was losing my mind. And that had a lot to do with or it led me to realize that there was a sense of abundance to be found in very small things, and that I could time travel, which was to say, I could expand and contract the sense of time by connecting with my hands and material goods through repeated meditative gestures, though that wasn't the purpose, it was a collateral benefit, by just picking out each stitch, as Reese has talked about, and like finding where the needle wants to go, of like repeatedly making these same gestures over and over again as a spell, as a call to something, to some beautiful future that seems worthy of preparing for, and therefore an act of hope, of wanting to reach forward to this future me who would have this thing that I would offer to myself, and kind of jump over the thousands of hours of prevaricating and like work and carting this around through airports, or in living rooms and in front of countless books on tape or whatever, but just that suddenly this thing would have it would exist from something that didn't exist, that I would have like alchemically conjured something out of this long spun strand. And that was really helpful for me also in recovering from not being a performing artist, to be able to say, I want something that I can shove in a bag and put in the corner and punish and say, I want you to think about what you've done. You're being very bad right now. You're giving me an extremely hard time, and I don't like that. So you're going to go over there and I'm going to ignore you for as long as it takes for me to figure out what the fuck I'm going to do with it next. And then pick it back up again and not really be lost, in the way that if I didn't sing for 2 weeks, that I had a lot of work to do to pick back up again, that my immediate access to that would be gone. So there's this thread of abundance that's become increasingly important as I become increasingly less employed or increasingly less financially solvent. And I've started picking things up out of the garbage and scrounging for fabrics by what's cast off, in an idea of I'm going to quilt with this one day. But what's actually really been, it's about trying to fill up the pantry, to fill up the cupboard, and to create this stash with some sense that this will provide me with endless opportunities, endless material to work with. And I have more things that I could ever do with, but it still lets me live in hope when I look at them and say, like, one day I have an idea about this thing and I want to turn it into this other thing. And I imagine then still that there is a future that I want to prepare for, where those things are possible, or where they may also not be necessary. How many blankets does a person really need? Not that many, actually, when you have one that you like, and maybe that you made yourself. Maybe one for summer and one for winter, and one to take for the park, and maybe one for the sofa, and one to eat on, and one to have sex with, and there's a lot of different kinds of planar surfaces that we can drag around with us and wrap around ourselves, and that can accompany us through life. So yeah, craft brought me abundance, and in something that felt very solitary about my experience of being a human being and being a mask-coated person, and not feeling necessarily that I had access to, for whatever strange, mysterious reason, to a stable cohort. That people come and go in my life a lot, and I've been very close with a lot of people and developed really strong bonds, and yet I've watched the ebb and flow of that, and have people move away, both geographically and emotionally, and that trying to find some other things to hang on to remind myself of those times, of that comfort, of those links, of that attachment, are important.
I do. I think it's so interesting that we talk about toxic masculinity as a separate thing from masculinity itself. I think it's so interesting that all three of you have gorgeous facial hair. So there's some part of each of you that is leaning directly into masculinity. And so I kind of want to end just by celebrating you know, we have toxic masculinity. That doesn't mean that masculinity is toxic. We're just trying to, yes, chest hair, all the hair. I love it. Thank you so much. Listeners, you're so sad you weren't here live to see the chest hair show. But again, I want to say again, like, we have toxic masculinity, but we also have fucking beautiful masculinity. And I'm so grateful and proud of the three of you for coming and sitting in circle with us and examining both toxic masculinity and beautiful masculinity. And I really want to celebrate masculinity in these last few minutes that we have together. I'm not really sure how, other than just to say, like, I celebrate your gorgeous masculinity, and I really appreciate your thoughtfulness in attempting to reject those toxic aspects of masculinity while still embracing the beautiful parts of your masculinity. So I guess just like, thank you, and you're gorgeous. Risa, maybe you can wrap that thought up better for me than I can.
No, I'm just going to turn it into an invitation. So thank you, and you're gorgeous. And last words, you know, the idea of slipping a spell through the cracks to people who are trapped in an idea or in friendships or things that don't give them peace in their journey of masculinity, whatever that looks like. Or maybe it's through like a crack to an earlier version of yourself. Like, what do you know? What's the spell you can offer, if there is one?
I would like to offer the spell of listening to the people surrounding you, surrounding me, and the spell of compassion, of self-compassion. It's every time I'm doing a ritual about things that I want to invite within myself, it's always the first thing. I think it's a lifelong journey. But yeah, listening and being compassionate first to oneself, to then be able to be compassionate with others. I think it's, for me, the road that I've taken to try and break free from these traps and like explore my gender, my masculinity, my femininity, not only just by myself, because we never exist only by ourselves.
Yeah, this is radical magic. You say it so humbly and so gently, and this is the most radical magic for all of us. But I do think, you know, having been in academic spaces or working with sound techs or like in these like very like male dominated rooms working in tech, where, you know, that stereotype was very lived out, where like the men in the room all felt like they had to take up all the space all the time, sometimes to the point where it felt tinged with a desperation. Like, we can all tell you've lost the thread, but you're still talking, like you're still screaming into the void because you feel like you need to know, you need to control, you need to land on something that affirms that you're in a place of power or that you're okay or something. And the kindness of including in our gender identities that the call to listen to each other, right? That like, it's okay. It's not necessarily about leaning in or leaning out or some sort of marketing buzzword, but like that we are these loops around each other and looping and weaving with listening to each other. And compassion can ease us, I think, out of performative masculinity and into something maybe much more powerful. So thank you so much for saying that. James, do you have a spell or like some sort of warrior scream?
May you slip the snare. May you find yourself in the unknown. May you let go of those who set expectations for you that don't honor the complexity of who you are. May you be devoted to being in the unknown and resting in the incomplete, knowing that there will never be a complete knowledge of who you are and the complexity of who you are. And may you enjoy drinking in that mystery with harm to none.
Jonathan, what you've said was already so beautiful. James, that blessing, I think we'll have to cut it out and make it something that stands alone so we can return to it. It's so beautiful and powerful. And Jonathan, you've gifted us with so many things you've said that brought me to tears. Do you have a closing blessing or a spell? Do you got one more for us as Amy's gesturing? You're done.
Oh, I'm definitely that person who can keep talking. I get to earn this extra spot by being deeply impactful, and so I get away with it. That's another source of power, being able to suck up a lot of extra space. The things I would
You were
like
invited.
to
You got the invitation.
Yeah.
That's right.
Invitation.
What I was thinking of to wrap up that came from earlier was more about affirmations. If we talked about masculinity in ways like a old skin that we wanted to shed, that I wanted to think about and affirm the things that were important to me and that have a like mask tinge to them, or that are coded, both coding like programming, but also coded like in slime or in sauce. And there's some idealized versions and that I'm discovering more now as in my now mid 40s, and like silver fox plaid shirt, you know, lesbian adjacent dad era, to solidity, to reliability, to a quiet strength that, like trees, can bend in the wind, but also stand and give shade. That will break and fall over in storms also. And that deep capacity to nurture is not something that's coded by gender, and that the rich creative aspect of life, of living, of like engendering things, is within all of us. As a like cis man, I think one of my major like life envies and like tragic Greek tragic kind of feelings is about not being able to give birth, and that a lot of my creative energy draws life from this inability to carry life inside of my body in that way. And it's an interesting wound to think to carry, but also to see what healing that, what addressing it and like engaging with it resonates out into the world, and all the things that I'm able to do with my life, with my energy, with this force that's inside of me. That's an exchange in some way for not having that capacity, and maybe striving to do so, but in other ways. And so think about generativity now at this period of like, what can I offer? What can I give back? And in giving and in generating, what am I offering to myself? And what ways am I also showing up and being solid and reliable for myself? And giving voice to that very small fragile thing inside of me, this sense of self, or this like small child, or this son or daughter of mine that is mine but isn't, and to let that person out to play.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for being with us at this strange time in the season and strange time in the world, strange time to be people. strange strange time to be trying to figure out how we make an impact that is healing or fertile, at least. And thanks for being so generous with your insights, struggles. I don't know. It felt like incredibly generous, the honesty that you shared with us today. So
we don't generally type vulnerability as a masculine trait, and I think all three of you have made us rethink that binary for sure.
yeah. So I'm gonna say blessed fucking be, but I'm also just but yeah, I'm gonna say blessed fucking be.
And we're gonna say happy Lammas, happy
happy-
Lunasa,
Yeah.
and blessed fucking be.
And blessed fucking be.
Blessed fucking be.
Yeah, but I also just, if you guys have 2 more seconds, because Connor and Rachel have been with us the whole time, if you do want to unmute or turn your cameras, say hi, respond to anything, I did want to give you the opportunity, although I know that's not always something that folks are here for. Hi, Rach.
Hey, I just wanted to say thank you. I think that that's exactly one of the biggest gifts that you folks gave tonight was your generosity of vulnerability, and we really appreciated hearing all of that. Thank you.
Yeah, I also wanted to thank you for sharing so much of your personal experiences. And I think one thing I was thinking of throughout was I was curious if anyone had maybe a role model or someone who's in your life that maybe acted as permission to go against the grain or to be some sort of deviant in a way. And even if it's not, maybe recorded, just curious if there was someone like that and kind of maybe some of the first steps you might have experienced in terms of maybe changing either mannerisms or aspects of how you experienced gender.
Yeah, I want everyone to answer, but I just want to say Fred Rogers, to bring the name Fred Rogers into the conversation. To me, like, Mr. Rogers is the epitome of what men can do if they are good and kind. Somebody else.
So I feel like I told this story or a number of stories which really slag my mother. And I feel a bit exposed about that, and that not representing the whole part of the story, and that actually the person who's possibly the most radical about helping me in this way is my mother, who did not code any of these things with like feminine traits, and that I learned, whether I liked it or not, to cook, to sew, to mend things, to take care of myself, to take care of my family, to bake pies when I didn't feel like baking pies, or to like make bread, and that I was deeply encouraged to sing and dance and be expressive and be loud, as long as I also was like extremely good at school. But I didn't grow up in a space where that felt weird or that was unwelcome and coded. My curiosity about these things was deeply fostered and encouraged.
I think my model is also like close and like family tied. It is Jonathan, actually, who's like, from the lack of judgment and guilt and shame, gave me the gift of being able to see my own self-shame and explore it and play with what I was and who I am, and celebrating it with me. It definitely being able to have someone close by who's just with opened arms and celebrating my person and like all of my what identified as my flaws, or my shame about like eating bags of candies and stuff like that, making me realize that the only thing now that was stopping me was myself.
I have two. One, I think the biggest exemplar for a lot of this stuff is seeing how most of the male figures who were in a position to help me failed me, and learning from each of those failures as much as I would from the permissions of people who would support me. Who that person was is my mom. My mom was like this like extremely strong non-binary person who like lifted weights with bandanas on and muscle shirts on. Yeah, my mom was fucking rad. She was the best. Oh, am I allowed to say that? Dang. My bad. Okay, time.
Oh no,
Yes.
swearing all the time. Yeah,
Okay, cool.
I should have opened with that.
No, that's my bad. I just forgot. I know we always do that in the coven stuff, so I should have known.
Alright,
But yeah,
you're
my mom
good,
was
you're
amazing non-binary person. Woo, doggy. She was the best. And she really gave me permission to be as weird and out there as I want to be. It's why I still watch the X-Files a lot. We used to watch that. We used to watch Sightings. Remember Sightings? Oh my gosh. Unsolved Mysteries. We were deep. We were deep in the original lore of the Sci-Fi Channel. Like deep. And that, I think being weird and permission to being weird is one of the greatest gifts. And I mean that in a very positive way. I don't mean it in I'm talking about like the muscular weird, where it's like, whatever the hell you want to do, just go do it. You interested in it? Let's go do it. And that was a big juxtaposition to other people whose love and acceptance was contingent upon me playing a role that I played within their world. I was a main character in her world. Just as now she's a main character in my world, within my deathwork practice. Because I talk to her all the time. I talked to her this morning. I got to get on that.
I wanted to say that craft allows me to bear witness to the process of becoming, to the thing coming into being that's being conjured by my fingers and from my tools, as well as the person I'm becoming by doing those particular things.
I mean, how? Because we don't use church language. Thank you.
Oh, the best.
Thank you.
Oh, the
You're
best. Thank you for this.
Okay, bye. I love you. I love you. I love you. Thank you for
Thank you,
conjuring
thank
the
you,
real.
Thank you,
Bye.
thank you
Thank you so much, my wise friends. I love you. Bye.
You aren't being a proper woman, therefore you must be a witch. You must be a witch.
If you want to support the Missing Witches Project, find out how at missingwitches.com and pre-order New Moon Magic, 13 Anti-Capitalist Tools for Resistance and Reenchantment by Risa Dickens and Amy Torek.